Greetings, it is I, Tantus Naravan Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome! It is time to continue my discussion on the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons, 5th Ed D&D. We've been diving into setting up your universe in the Dungeon Master's Guide. A little bit of information that a Dungeon Master would need to craft their worlds. We're moving on from that and talking about crafting your adventure. Because this is actually one of the greatest things a Dungeon Master can do. Craft an adventure. You're making up a story. You're adding in elements of fantasy, interesting places, combats, encounters, traps, things that fill you with excitement and should reflect it in the excitement in your characters when they play in it. Fundamentally, every adventure is a story. And the way that they're a story can often compare to other types of media. The easiest way of comparing it is you have to think of it like an episodic drama, maybe something like a soap opera, or even something like an ongoing comic book series that has that overarching narrative aspect linking each of the adventures together, mainly by your heroes, but perhaps by the adventures they go on. They could go on one major adventure, smaller ones that are all narratively linked together. The point is to take all these individual aspects, individual ventures and scenes, and craft them into one flowing narrative. Now, whether or not you're deciding to craft your own adventure, or start with a pre-made world or pre-made adventure, I'm going to be giving you some suggestions over the course of the next couple of episodes that are going to help you to build your adventure. You're going to be taking the three main aspects: exploration, social interaction, and combat, and using each of those in a proper manner to build your story, using each of these examples in a story, but also then seamlessly blending them together to make one narrative. You don't want just disjointed scenes. Just because you want a little bit of exploration, a little bit of combat, if you don't blend them, it won't make sense for your story. You want that blending, so your story flows from start to end. Now let's talk about some important elements to your game. You're going to need a credible threat. Now, what this means is your players are going to have something that is going to be a threat to them, whether it's a villain, a monster, or some kind of villainous organization. It should be something that will pose a challenge to them that they can go against in the course of the adventure. This group or creature is going to have its own goals and aspirations, which your characters should be able to thwart. Next up, you want to use familiar tropes. Okay, yeah, you want to use a lot of the fantasy tropes with a clever twist. So there are lots of fantasy tropes out there. Fantasy's been out for a lot of years. A good example, Dungeons & Dragons, adventuring parties starting in a tavern. The amount of times tavern-based starting adventures have occurred. Majority of them. There are other times you could go somewhere else, but tavern is the classic one. What you want to do is you want to have these things because they are familiar grounds for your players. Their characters they can basically work their characters into them a little easier. I know about this, tavern-based adventure, so I'm starting in a tavern. So when I start there, I'm feeling more comfortable there and I can dive into my character better. But putting little twists on it is what makes it unique in your own. Make something a little different than normal. Add a little twist to one of these normal tropes to make it unique. Don't push it too far, though. You want to push these little twists in a way that would work with your characters and allow them to still get into the story the way you want to. Focus on the present. That's another important element you want to have. It's fine to have a backstory and a history that you're including in with your adventure that your players might be able to discover, but don't make it a focus. It should reflect upon what's going on in present day if they're discovering this history. It should be important to that. Anything else is really a detraction from the storyline you're trying to actually do because your characters are in the present. They're doing things in the present, so of course you want to focus on that present day rather than dwelling on the past, which is not as important. Again, bits of information might be, but overall, it's not. You're going to want your players to matter. This really takes two aspects to this element. The first is that the player's actions have consequences and effects. Now, that actually does technically define both of it, but it's two aspects of the same thing, that their actions have effect. It might be that the actions of them as the adventures of completing various quests and missions will have an overall effect on the game world, will change things. You might be working for an army to help undermine the other army, might help you win the war, which wouldn't have been won otherwise. That's in effect that your heroes will matter. In the same retrospect, the decisions they make on the small term should make a difference. You don't want to railroad them. You might still want to push them in a direction, but don't make them feel like they're railroaded. They can get any option they want. Be prepared for these options. You might make it that all these options end up in the same place, but don't make it feel like they all would have when originally they're hitting it. So that way it feels that it's more organic, that they're flowing to this place. You're not shoving them in a direction. You're making it feel like the decisions they make matter in the long run. Cause something different in what you were going to plan because they made that decision. Maybe if they went someplace else first, and the other city was going to end up under attack, it's in worse shape than they would have originally ended up there. And they're like, oh, the attack started a couple of days ago. We would have been better off. Your heroes would have learned there's consequences to their actions and feel the weight of it, that the weight of what they do in the world matters. Maybe they couldn't have done anything to help this city, but maybe they could have. Use surprise. Surprise can take many forms. Surprise could be a location that you discover, unusual one in an unusual place, like finding some kind of ancient tomb while exploring a swamp that you didn't see coming. You weren't expecting to find this. Or anything else, like you find something unusual in a place and you're like, oh wow, this is neat. It fills me with excitement that look what we discovered. That's the location element of surprise. Surprise can also be within monsters you're fighting. Have monsters use unusual tactics or different tactics than normal. Again, for this one in particular though, don't push it too hard. Just because you want to use different tactics doesn't mean you should. Sometimes they just want to have a normal battle with orcs if they're fighting orcs. Orcs always having something unusual and interesting about the tactics they're using might be cool, but it isn't important to the overall story you're attempting to craft. So you want to make sure to craft it in the correct direction, almost in this case. Another possible way of altering combat, though, pairing monsters that they wouldn't expect together. Choose a pair of monsters which wouldn't normally be working together, come up with a great reason why they're together, throw them at your players. It's unusual, it's surprising, they're like, why are they working together? There's a story behind it. It makes them curious with the story. It engages them with this encounter. Make it something interesting. That's what you're going to do. The surprise is supposed to make it that you're exciting people with the, what's that? That's the surprise of it. You're drawing them into it to make them want to learn more. Use useful maps. What this really means is when you have your players exploring anything, make the map feel organic. If they're exploring a forest, it's not just going to be a wasteless, endless expanse. Even if they're traveling through it from point A to point B, there's probably going to be all kinds of landmarks and places that could be visited within that forest that they don't need to necessarily visit, but they could. And their wanderings might encounter some of them. Maybe one of the trails takes them by this old burned out tree that's been there for ages that people say is cursed, that people keep a little wide distance from the path goes close to it so you can see it. There's a story behind that. Maybe if players want to bother with it, sleep next to it, something like that, you have something occur. It just makes the world feel more organic, that there's these places and things that they could go to that give them more options. That's what we were talking about earlier, giving your characters options. It's the same way when you're designing a dungeon. Make multiple routes they could take. Don't just have it that they have to go from point A, point B. Have it that they could explore all different ways. Have it that, different floors, if they've got them, maybe there's a couple different ways to travel in between them. Maybe there's branching corridors in a dungeon that they can choose the different corridors to go down, exploring them in whatever order they want in. It makes it that when anybody would encounter this adventure on their own, they encounter it in their own way. It gives it a more organic feel to the entire thing and makes it your own. Now, you don't have to be a master of designing maps and art in order to get one. Of course, you could design your own, but the internet's a great place for it. There are plenty of places where you can get maps which people have provided for free online for other people to use, and you could get one of them. You could also use real-world structures or places as examples for building sort of a map. Almost use pictures for making it. There's also computer tools and graphical tools which can help you create things a lot easier than, let's just say, hand drawing something in the long run. And the last thing I do want to talk about after the maps is something for every player on the table. What does this mean? Well, as I talked about earlier on in these episodes about dungeon mastering, there's all kinds of players you're going to encounter. Each one of them is going to have something unique they want to bring into and use when it comes to the table, the adventuring table. It is up to you to find the middle ground for all of them, that you allow all your players to find what they want when they come to the table to get to roleplay. This is going to be the trifecta of course, exploring, social interactions, and combat. Finding the balance between all three of these is what makes every type of player happy. If you can find that perfect balance, every type of player, the player that likes combat, the player that likes exploring, the player that loves social interactions, they will all get their opportunities to do what they want at the table. Now, it could come to a situation where the entire table might not seem to like combat at all. Then go ahead and sort of remove some of that balance. Lessen the effects of combat. Maybe you get a feeling that your team wants to always speak it out peacefully. Give them these options. You're going to make it from a combat encounter to a social interaction. If it sounds like all the players are on board for that, do it. You're changing it to what your players would be happiest with. And you're going to see what your players as a group a little better what it is. You're not going to necessarily pertain it to each individual. If it seems like there is a consensus in the group, then yes, you will change it accordingly. But if there's not that consensus, you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to look to what type of player each of my players are. Use just that combination of these three things to find the perfect sort of balance in your game. So that's it for today. I first talked about some of the basics of adventure building, letting you know what it compares to. And then I went over the elements of building an adventure. These are important elements that if you look to each of these elements and try to at least follow them, you don't necessarily need to. Your adventure might call for one of these elements to be altered in a way. That's because it's your adventure. But as long as you look to them, you can craft a good story. You can look to each of these elements and see, am I putting this in my story in a way that makes sense? Maybe. If you are, then of course, yes, it's awesome. You're building your adventure well. You can enjoy it. And it's the point of crafting it in a way that your players can enjoy it too. And that's where all these elements come in. They are made to engage your players to your adventure. So if you have any questions, comments, anything you want to say, anything you think I left out, please leave in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe. It shows you support the channel, the Empire, the work I do. If you want to show some extra support, you could always check out my Patreon. Link in the description below. But regardless, until the next time, I bid you farewell.